Here we go, guys. Good morning. It's nice to see everybody. I am Jenna Winters from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, Parks and Watercraft, and this is going to be our webinar on Ohio's amphibians. So I'm going to do some quick introductions here. I would like to first introduce Catherine Connor. Say hello, Catherine.
Hi, guys and gals.
There. Hang on a second. And this is Lauren Broderick, who is another one of our presenters today.
Hi, like Jenna mentioned, my name is Lauren Broderick, and I'm actually coming here today from Maumee Bay State Park. You might have seen me before when talking about turtles and snakes and other things, but what's really neat, especially if you're in Northwest Ohio, Maumee Bay is right at the edge of Lake Erie, and so we're in a marsh. And one of the most common animals that you can see here are frogs. We have a ton of different frogs. There's actually a boardwalk that goes almost 2 miles through the marsh area, so it's a great look, especially if you're looking for amphibians. It's a great place to go to be able to check them out. And at the very end of this presentation, I'm going to actually have some animals to show you that are here from Maumee Bay State Park.
All right, thanks, Lauren.
Hi, everybody. As Jenna mentioned, my name is Catherine Connor, and I am from Houston Woods State Park. Houston Woods is actually known for our raptors, so you might have seen me on our Birds of Prey webinar, but today I am excited to talk to you about amphibians. That is one of my passions. I love going out into the creeks and searching under rocks and trying to find as many toads and frogs and salamanders as possible. So I'm very excited to share with you today a little bit about Ohio's amphibians in particular. And before we get started, I really like to talk about why amphibians are so special, because they are fairly small, and especially when you think of salamanders, they're pretty secretive, so it's often forgotten that they're even there. But why are these animals so special? I like to talk about that they really completely change their lives. We think of butterflies as going through this complete metamorphosis from a caterpillar to a butterfly, but amphibians do the same thing. They go from an egg to a tadpole or a larval state, and then they emerge onto land or go back into water. They can lose gills, they can gain gills, they can do all this wonderful stuff. So that makes them pretty special. And that emerging is also something that's pretty amazing about amphibians. And I'm going to say amazing amphibians a lot today because I like the alliteration. But emerging, they were one of the first organisms to actually do that millions of years ago. They kind of estimate about 200 million years ago, the first amphibians went from being just water to coming up onto land. And then kind of the other thing that we'll talk about more later when we talk about some of our salamanders is they also have this regrowing property about them that a lot of times if they lose a limb or if they lose part of their tail, they can actually regrow that. And so I know there's a lot of scientists out there that are actually studying that to see if it can somehow impact and help humans as well. So our amphibians are something just really to kind of pay tribute and respect to. So hopefully after the presentation today, you will love them just as much as I do. But I will go ahead and point out our PowerPoint here, and we'll start going through some slides. This very first one is just a nice introduction, a couple of the species that I have found myself and caught, and obviously gone back into the wild. We don't keep any of our any animals unless they can't survive out in the wild on their own. So as we start our PowerPoint here today, I will get control of the PowerPoint here in just a second. But as I'm waiting for that, we can talk about the species that we see here on this first page. So we've got, starting in the top corner, we have our red-spotted newt. Going around, we have a toad, we have our green frog, we have a redback salamander, we have a yellow spotted salamander that I had caught. We have a two-lined salamander, a gray tree frog, and another red-spotted newt down in the bottom as well. I apologize, guys. I am having a little bit of trouble with my PowerPoint here. There we go. All right, so for our first slide here, you'll notice we changed into what exactly is an amphibian. So the word amphibian actually kind of translates to dual life, so meaning 2 stages of life. Now there are some amphibians that do go through 3 stages, but we'll talk about that later. Don't want to jump the gun there a little bit. So that dual life though. So with amphibians, like I said, they go through a complete metamorphosis. Whether it's a salamander or a frog, they're going to be laid as an egg, and that egg is going to be in a very moist kind of gelatinous jelly substance. If you've ever felt it, I think it feels just like jam in the store. But it's very, very sticky. It's got your eggs inside. They're not actually in a shell or anything. That's why they're in the jelly. The jelly is what protects them. And so once they go from that egg, they're going to go into that either a larval state or a tadpole stage, and then they'll kind of live their life there for a moment, and then they will go ahead and transition into adult stage, which a lot of our amphibians, their adult stage is going to be on land. They will still stay, some of them will still stay around water, but they become a more terrestrial animal that we think of. Some other things that make an amphibian is when you look at them, you're going to notice that they don't have any claws, they don't have any scales on their body. With the rest of our reptiles in our webinar series, you might have seen that they have scales. Some of our lizards do have claws, our turtles have claws. Amphibians don't, they just have very soft toes. And then the other pretty neat thing about them is they are cold-blooded as well. So if you remember, we are warm-blooded. So when we go to the doctors, they take our temperature, and we always should be right around the same number. With cold-blooded animals, that is definitely not the case. Cold-blooded animals are going to be whatever temperature is really around them. So if they're in a cold environment, their body temperature is going to be cold. If it's a nice sunny day, they're going to be warmed up. And that's why a lot of times you'll see reptiles in particular out basking on rocks and things, is because they're trying to get their body temperature up, and they like being able to move a little bit more. For our amphibians, they're the exact same way, but a lot of times they tend to stay cooler. So you'll see them in the water cooling off. You'll see them up on rocks when they're basking. Salamanders are pretty secretive, and they like to stay underneath of rocks, but that can still be a nice warm spot as well, And what's really neat about our amphibians is how they survive the winter. So remember, they're cold-blooded, so what they're going to need to do is they don't want to freeze. They don't want to be in those 0-degree temperatures. So a lot of our amphibians actually burrow down just like our reptiles do. So they're going to dig down, whether that be on land and dig under the frost line and kind of stay put, or if they're in the water, they'll dig down deep into that murky mud and kind of stay there as well. Cold-blooded animals have that ability to just kind of slow their body down and take in very limited amounts of oxygen, whether that be through their skin or a certain part of their body. And our amphibians will survive the winter that way. But the next thing I would like to talk about is going to be kind of talking about how amphibians really differ from reptiles, because often they're kind of grouped together and they are 2 separate animals, and sometimes they have a problem with getting misidentified for one another. So let's talk about our next slide here. All right, so reptiles versus amphibians. Remember I mentioned that amphibians are going to have a nice soft, moist skin. They're not going to have any scales. That skin really plays a part because there are actually some amphibians that don't have lungs, and so they breathe and absorb oxygen through their skin. And then remember I mentioned that they have no claws. In kind of comparison, our reptiles are going to be dry, they're scaly. Even if a reptile is an aquatic species, like some of our turtles, like painted turtles, red-eared sliders, map turtles, even our snakes, like a northern water snake, they're going to be in the water, but as soon as they get out and dry out, they're going to be very scaly. Whereas amphibians, if they're in the water and they get out, they're still going to be soft. They're going to have that smoothness to their skin. And then reptiles also have those claws. And those claws are great for them. They are, can be used for protection. They can be used for digging. They can be used for helping get food. The claws really are great for our reptiles. Some things that they compared together have some similar things are going to be that they're cold-blooded and that they do lay eggs. So remember I mentioned that amphibians lay those nice jelly masses of eggs, and then our reptiles will lay eggs, but those eggs can either be in what we think of like a nest, where they will dig down in the mud and lay eggs, or underneath of rocks and lay eggs, or even some reptiles will carry their eggs inside of their body, and when they're ready to hatch, they hatch and they give birth to live young. So both amphibians and reptiles will go ahead and lay eggs. The examples that I have up here to kind of show you some comparisons and how easy it is to really misidentify something as either an amphibian or a reptile. Looking on our amphibian side of our presentation, the very bottom we have a red-spotted newt. Red-spotted newts often get misidentified for lizards, but they're not. You'll notice his toes are pointed. They don't have any claws on the end though, they're just pointed. And his skin does look bumpy, but it's still very soft and smooth. That's just some coloration pattern onto his skin. Moving up, we've got one of our dusky salamanders, and those dusky salamanders, have that nice smooth skin to them, and if they move very quickly, which salamanders can do, they can either get misidentified for a lizard or they can get misidentified for a snake if they're that fast. But looking at it as a still photo, you can definitely tell it's got moist skin, no claws. That's one of our salamanders. The very last amphibian I have up there is going to be our gray tree frog. A gray tree frog we'll talk about later, but it's got that nice bumpy skin. It's still smooth though, it's still moist, no claws for him there. And then we will bump over to our reptiles. We've got our ring-necked snake there, which does have scales, even if they're smooth scales. He still has scales, his skin is still dry. Same thing with our five-lined skink over on the side there. That five-lined skink has scales. You can even start to see at the very end of his toes, he does have claws. And then moving down, we've got our fence lizard who, if you look closely, you can actually see some overlapping scales on him. He's got claws at the end of his toes. We've definitely got good examples of reptiles there. So moving forward, though, we're going to just focus on our amphibians. We're going to talk about what species we have here in Ohio, what makes them so special, and we will go to our next slide. Frogs. Frogs are where I'd love to start out. Frogs in Ohio are one of my favorites because they're usually a good indicator that springtime is here. And after a long winter, especially a hard cold winter, I'm ready to start hearing the chirps of frogs. We have in Ohio about 15 species, 4 different families of frogs. So when I talk about families, that's how frog species are kind of broken up. So we've got true frogs, we've got tree frogs, we have our true toads, and then we also have a little bit of an oddball, and we'll talk about that spadefoot at the very end. But we've got these species of frogs in Ohio, and when we talk about frogs, we're going to talk about a species that go from an egg to a tadpole to a frog. These frogs are going to have pretty smooth skin. They're going to have moist skin. They're going to lay their eggs in a big mass, a big clump, basically. And where you're going to find those eggs are going to be in a very deep pool. They're not going to be in shallow areas. They're going to be in a nice pond setting. And then when they actually emerge and become adults, the way that those animals move is unique to a frog. They are going to leap. So they're going to do that hopping from place to place. And we'll talk about how that can differ from some of our other frog species here in a minute. But the first ones I wanted to point out, we're going to go through those 15 species of frogs. I'm going to tell you how to identify each one. And my favorite is trying to learn the different calls. So if you hear a frog out in the wild, you'll be able to identify what exactly it is. So the first 2 I want to talk about here today are northern green frogs and bullfrogs. These are going to be some of the largest species that we have here in Ohio. The bullfrog in particular is the largest. But the bullfrog, the way you can kind of tell them apart, because they're going to get misidentified with green frogs a lot. because they do look fairly similar. Size is one thing. Bullfrogs are going to be big, but green frogs can get large as well. So what else can we look at? You'll notice I have that arrow pointing to that green frog's back. And that's because there's a line that goes down its back. And what that line is basically it's like a dorsolateral ridge. It's just a ridge on his back that green frogs do have. Bullfrogs do not have that. You'll notice that behind their eye, it does not continue onto their back. What is interesting though for that bullfrog is right behind those eardrums, that big nice circle. What that's going to tell me though is if it's a male or a female. Males are going to have a little bit larger of an eardrum, and then the females will have a smaller one. And so if you do find a bullfrog and you want to tell if it's a female or a male, that's one easy way. It's just that nice big circle there. Bullfrogs though, you can kind of tell their call. Their call is going to sound a lot like a moo, 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 moo. In advance, guys, you're going to hear me making a lot of weird noises, but that is so you can out there start making the same noises as I am and get really good at your frog calls by next spring when you'll start to hear them again. So you've got that bullfrog doing that moo, 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 whereas the northern green frog sounds a lot like the plucking of a cord. So if you've got a guitar or anything like that, even a shoestring, a really tight string, and you just pluck it and do like a that's going to be your green frog. Both are going to be a fairly consistent call, but it's going to be versus a to a moo, moo, moo. That bullfrog is really deep and it's going to be pretty easy to identify in comparison. So those are some of our true frogs. Let's move on to our next slide, which is going to be a couple of our different frogs, a little bit smaller species here. So we're going to talk about our mountain chorus frog versus our spring peeper, which I'm certain that you guys have all heard of spring peeper before. You might not have known that that's what you were listening to, but they, even though they're very, very small, make a lot of noise. So the way that you can tell visually the difference between these two is going to be the pattern on their back. So the mountain chorus frog, you'll notice that I have that line pointing to its almost looks like an H on their back, kind of talk about that curvature. So that H versus the spring peeper, when you look at their back, they've got more of an X on the back. The other thing that I kind of look at even more than that back pattern, because sometimes it can get a little cloudy between an X and an H sign, is going to be on the mountain chorus frog, that triangle. That nice defined triangle on the back of their head is a very easy way to tell exactly which frog we're looking at. Now, the way that we can tell them apart as well is the sound. So spring peepers are one of the first ones to call, and they're going to be that very high-pitched peep, 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 and they will go forever, and there'll be so many clustered together that it will be just overwhelming the senses sometimes how many and how loud that sound can be. And these frogs are tiny and they can make such a loud noise. Now the other frog that I have up there, that mountain chorus frog, has a totally different call. Their call is going to be a lot like if you run your finger over a comb. So if you've got a comb at home, you just, that nice quick brushing, that whoop, 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 is going to be your mountain chorus frog. And now I talk about that comb being very fast because there's another frog that has a comb-like sound, but it's not going to be nearly as fast as this, and it's going to be very similar to that high-pitchedness of our spring peeper. So those are two kind of smaller versions of frogs that you're going to see here in Ohio. I'm going to move to my next slide here, and these frogs are going to be a little bit more of a medium-sized frog. These are going to be your northern leopard frog and your pickerel frog. Now, I both think these are beautiful frogs. They've got this great pattern to both of them. And at quick glance, it might be hard to distinguish which one is which. So let's talk about a couple of their defining characteristics. So you'll notice I'm pointing to the spots with our arrows. So those spots are going to tell us a lot. On the leopard frog, they're going to be more like circles. And then on the pickerel frog, you'll notice they're a little bit more square. But again, that can be pretty hard to distinguish because a lot of those pickerel frogs spots, yes, they're not perfect circles, but they could still be somewhat circular. So some other characteristics to look for are going to be, I have an arrow pointing to kind of his hips. And that underbelly and thigh area is going to have a nice yellow color to it, which the leopard frog will not have. And so if you're looking at the spot and you can't really tell, go ahead and look at that thigh area, and that'll give you a distinguished, yes, this is a pickerel frog, or yes, this is a leopard frog. The other way that you can tell these two species apart is going to be where you find them. So northern leopard frogs are very common in murky water. So sometimes it's hard to actually find them. They like to stay our frogs are secretive, so they like to stay kind of in that murky area, unseen by predators, by humans, everybody alike. Whereas our northern pickerel frog tends to be more in clear water, and both species you can kind of see on land sometimes. But the thing that I really want to talk about with pickerel frogs is a lot of people ask me, are there any poisonous frogs in Ohio? Because when you think of frogs, a lot of people go immediately to the poison dart frogs and those nice big tropical, they're little frogs, but they have a big impact. We don't have any of those, but what we do have is this pickerel frog. The secretion that it has on its skin can be very irritating to your skin, and definitely if you were to get it up into your mouth. First of all, don't be kissing the frogs. They're not going to turn into princes or anything like that. So be very careful when handling frogs, in particular the pickerel frog. The pickerel frog, like I said, can have an irritant to their skin, which will then, that liquid will irritate your skin, and it can also irritate dogs. Like if the dogs were to accidentally grab a frog, it can irritate them as well. So with our two frogs though here, not only can you tell them apart by their looks, tell them apart where they live, you can also tell them apart by their sound. And these two have very fun sounds. The leopard frog, you cannot mistake it with anything else. And it also, I describe it as like a snore followed by a laugh. And then it makes me laugh afterwards, especially when I hear it in the wild. So that northern leopard frog is going to go, ha ha, ha ha, ha ha. And I even laugh when I make the call myself. But it's going to be, remember that snore, ha ha, ha ha, ha ha, ha ha, followed by that. Whereas the pickerel frog is something completely different. If you've ever seen, growing up, we watched a lot of sci-fi movies. If you couldn't tell, I'm a little bit of a nerd. But watching those sci-fi movies, you often had spacecrafts come in, and those spacecrafts would have this sound about them. And that's what this call really makes me think of. It's a wong, 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 wong. So kind of that nice boom, boom, boom noise. So you've got two frogs that look very similar. They're very similar in size, but they are, couldn't be more different. Couldn't be more different in their looks, their living conditions, or the sounds that they make. These next frogs that I'm going to talk about are going to be ones that are a little bit, one of which is going to be seen a little bit more, and one you might never see. So let me move here to our next slide.
Hey, Catherine, real
Yes.
quick, we have a question. It's from an anonymous viewer, and they want to know, aren't pickerel frogs poisonous?
Yeah, so if you remember, I mentioned that pickerel frogs, they're going to be irritating to your skin. So if an animal were to ingest them, they would get that poison. But we would just get the irritant to our skin, which also would mean that would not be a good frog to eat for us. There are some frogs, and I know we've got, later in our presentation, we're going to have a little bit of a talk about frog hunting and things like that. So we'll mention the species that you can eat and would want to eat. Pickerel frogs would not be that. Thank you, and I really hope you guys are utilizing our Q&A box because we love to hear from you, and it does make our presentation that much more fun. So please ask your questions. As we move on though through our frogs, we're going to talk about two more here. We're going to talk about our wood frog and our western chorus frog. So they are going to be similar sized frogs, but the real big kind of distinguishing characteristics for them are going to be how they look and where they live as well. So wood frogs are actually a fairly terrestrial frog. So when I say that, that means they, once they've, lost their gills, lost their tail, they come back up on land, they're gonna stay pretty dry. They can still go back in the water and everything like that, might still stay in nice damp areas, but as the name suggests, wood, you find them a lot in woodlands. And the way that you can tell the difference between a wood frog and a chorus frog are going to be that wood frog has a nice dark mask, and then the chorus frog, even though they have a very thin mask, it has a nice pattern to its back. It always has 3 lines that kind of look like a scratch down its back of those dark 3 colors. So we've got the nice dark 3 colors versus the wood frog that's not going to have that back pattern at all. And then with our western chorus frog, I mentioned that the wood frog is going to be on land, but the chorus frog is very rarely seen. It also can be on land or in the water, but what it's going to do is it's going to bury itself down. It's going to bury itself down deep into mud and that nice dirt and kind of stay nice and secretive. And so I have not even seen a western chorus frog out in the wild, unfortunately. One day, hopefully. But like I said, they like to really bury themselves down deep. Wood frogs, I have seen, they're a little bit more, hey, here I am out in the world where you are. The sounds that they make are going to be also pretty different. The wood frog is going to be a nice cluck. It's going to be about 5 to 6 clucks in one grouping and a pause, and then another 5 to 6 clucks. So it's going to be a cluck, 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 cluck. Whereas that chorus frog, I'm going to bring back in my comb again, and instead of that nice fast pitch call of the comb earlier, which was our mountain chorus frog, a western chorus is going to be a nice slow comb. A nice so a much slower call than that mountain chorus frog. Western chorus is that nice slow call, and the wood frog is going to have that cluck to it. The next frogs that I'd like to talk about, I hear all the time around my home. I also get to see them a lot around my home. So on my next slide here, what I'm going to talk about is going to be some of our tree frogs. It's going to be our Cope's gray tree frog and then our gray tree frog. And it's going to be very hard if you find one of these guys out in the wild to tell the difference. They live in the same areas. They're going to live in trees, shrubs, hedges, that type of environment is where they're going to be living. They also look very similar. They have those nice spots on them. They've got some coloration that is the same. You'll notice I have that line pointing to their face. They've got nice light color underneath of their eyes. It is very, very hard to distinguish these two. They also have the same type of feet because they are both gray tree frogs. One's just Cope's gray tree frog. They're going to have large toe discs, and it's a little bit tricky to see in these pictures. On the very top, you might be able to see that toe a little bit better, but they've got these nice large discs on the end of their toes. No, they're not claws, they're discs. What those are very sticky, and that's how they can actually climb up those trees, shrubs, hedges, etc. The sounds that they make are exactly the same. The calls that they make is going to be that that nice burp, burp noise. But the difference between the two is, so gray tree frogs, the one on the bottom, is going to be found all throughout Ohio. The Cope's gray tree frog is just found in southwestern Ohio, like where I am. And then their calls, if you get really good at them and you have to just keep playing both of them over and over again to try to distinguish between the two, because they do make the same call, the Cope's gray tree frog on top is just going to have that call a little bit faster and a little bit sharper. Whereas the gray tree frog on the bottom, that call will still sound the same, but it's going to be slower. And because it's slower, it sounds a little bit more musical, a little bit softer. It's not going to be as harsh and as like kind of hurt your ears a little bit. So if you play those two calls side by side, just constantly trying to pick up on the differences, you might be able to then figure out in the wild whether you have a Cope's gray tree frog or a gray tree frog. Also remember your location is going to tell you that as well. If you're here in southwestern Ohio, you might have one or the other. The rest of Ohio, you probably will just go ahead and have our gray tree frog. What I'll do next is we're going to move on to our last two frogs, and these ones are pretty interesting characters. I want to talk about the bottom picture first, so that eastern cricket frog, and I bring that up because he is also a tree frog. It's not going to have the large toe discs like the other Cope's gray and the gray tree frog. These eastern crickets have very small discs on the ends of their toes, so they can still climb and do really great things like that, but they just don't appear as a tree frog. They actually get misidentified for toads a lot in this area because they are in western Ohio. So eastern cricket frogs being in western Ohio have these kind of what looks like warts or bumps on their back. So a lot of times people will ask me about these frogs thinking that they are toads and thinking they need to worry about their hands. Those are just going to be bumps on their body. They're not actually warts or glands or anything like that. And the really neat thing about these guys is the sound that they make. So the sound that these cricket frogs make, if you see them, it sounds a lot like glass hitting each other. So it sounds a lot like, and it will be even faster than that. It's a, I often tell people, if you, we played marbles a lot when I was a kid. If you had two marbles and you clicked them together, that's a lot like what a cricket frog would sound like. And if you're down here in western Ohio, or over here in western Ohio, excuse me, really interesting frog to get to see. They're out in the wild. The frog on top, so the eastern spadefoot, a lot of people will call that a toad, and it's not actually a true toad, and it's not a true frog either, or a tree frog. It's actually in its own family, and it's a very unique species that we have in Ohio. It is incredibly rare. It's also endangered in Ohio. So if you've gotten to see these guys in the wild, that's amazing. Also, there's a good chance you're not going to unless you go out looking for them and know that area. So like I said, very rare, endangered, and not to mention, they like to hide as well. So they have very long toes, and those kind of horny pointed toes allow them to dig and burrow themselves down deep into, the sand and dirt and things. So they do like to hide. And then what's really great about these guys is those big eyes. I always thought that frogs had large eyes in comparison with other animals to begin with. On that spadefoot, they are very prominent. They are much more protruded than our other frogs. Just a lot of their characteristics are going to be very different than our other frog species. Remember I said those long toes, they're not going to have any discs on the end because they're not tree frogs. Just long pointed toes enables them and helps them to dig. They've got those large protruding eyes to help see. And then the sound that they make is a little funny. It does sound like a little bit of a cat. So if you ever heard a meow, it's a meow, bow, meow, bow. It's a combination of a meow and a bee wow. So adding a B instead of an M. So a meow, bow, meow, bow, meow, bow. Very, very interesting frog species that we have here in Ohio. Just don't get discouraged if you don't see them out in the wild because, I haven't either. but I have gotten to see them through videos and things like that. It is an interesting species to look up if you're not familiar with them. The next thing that I want to talk about, I kind of want to transition a little bit. I mentioned that some of these species here can get misidentified for toads. Let's take a second to talk about toads. I feel like toads, on our next slide here, let me get there, is going to be an example of their skin, because a lot of people get very scared when they interact with toads. And going back to that idea of poisonous frogs here in Ohio, toads often have what people think are warts on their back. And once they touch them, they think they're then going to get warts. You're not going to get warts because those aren't warts. Those are just glands on their skin. But those glands can secrete a liquid that can be very irritating to your skin, and again, very irritating to your mouth. So if a dog were to bite a toad, it could get pretty foamy and it could be pretty dangerous for them. So we don't want, you know, obviously we don't want people eating toads. We don't want to let our dogs mess with these animals. And that toxin that they can do, it's definitely harmful for the smaller mammals. And then it's called bufotoxin, and that's comes from the toad family. They are in Bufodidae, but that is totally separate. Let's just talk about our toads here in Ohio. A lot of times people will separate toads and frogs, and that's because they are, you know, a little different. However, all toads are frogs. Just not all frogs are toads. And the reason I say that is they're all in the same order. And then as they break down into these families, you then have your true toads. And your true toads are going to be the species that we have here in Ohio. And these species will exhibit some different characteristics than our other frogs. They're going to have still an egg, tadpole, and toad stage, so still that 3 stages of life. And then they're going to have, like I said, those glands, and instead of leaping from place to place like our frogs, they're going to hop. It's a much shorter distance that they travel, so they're not going to have that nice big giant leap. And then the biggest thing that I've noticed with finding frogs versus toads is actually how they lay their eggs. I always just, it amazes me. I swear a toad will see a puddle of water and go, yep, that's where I'm going to lay my eggs. Where I mentioned frogs will find those nice big ponds, lakes, sides, things like that to lay their eggs. Toads, the closest body of water is good for them. So you have to be really careful. When I was younger, I would constantly have to take water out to a puddle and fill it until those eggs grew legs and then became adults. Because they will just lay their eggs anywhere. And the way they lay their eggs are very different too. So frogs will tend to have that jelly material in a nice big mass, whereas toads will lay that jelly material in a nice strand. So we've got our hop instead of a leap. We have dry, bumpy skin with those glands, and then we have how and where they lay their eggs. So let's talk about the 2 toads that we have here in Ohio. So I will move to our next slide here. And we have 2 different toads here in Ohio. Oh, just give me 1 second, guys. Our 2 toads that we have here in Ohio are going to be a Fowler's toad and an American toad. And I'm going to help you guys today to distinguish between the 2. So we're looking at their spots, and we're going to actually look at those glands or those warts. So for Fowler's toads, we're looking at their chest. They're going to have about 1 to 3 spots on their belly. So that nice light color that they are, they'll have some dark bumps, or not bumps, excuse me, dark spots on their belly. Whereas the American toad down on the bottom is going to have speckles all over that light colored body. That's kind of the #1 thing I look for when I have a toad is, does it have a nice speckled body or does it just have a couple spots? And that will tell you a Fowler versus an American. The other thing is that the Fowlers, we're going to look at their thighs again. We're going to look at some hips. And on our American toad, they do have some of those glands and bumps on their thighs, whereas the fowlers do not have them. The other thing is going to be the sound that they make. The American toad sounds a lot like a bullfrog, except it is a very long call. So it's still going to be that burr, 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 but it's going to be, I mean, it can last for more than 10 seconds sometimes, a burr, burr, burr. Whereas the fowler's toad doesn't exactly sound like a crying baby, but it has that wah, wah, wah sound. That wah, wah versus burr, 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 that kind of call. They're going to be living in similar areas though, so that can be a little bit kind of confusing for some folks. So it's really important to make sure you look for that spotted belly versus just those few dark spots. What I want to do next is I'm going to move to my next slide here, because there's a lot of things with these amphibians. People want to know, why is this information important to them? What can they do for these frogs? What should they be doing for these frogs? So as I move to my next slide here, I just am saying, our frogs and toads and you, how can you interact together and how can you help them? Some things that you can do to help our amphibian species, and it's going to be very similar with our salamanders, but we'll talk about that later, is you just want to respect them. You want to make sure that you have your nice clean waterways. You want to do what you can to limit your pesticide use, because anything that you put on your land is going to eventually wash down into their land. So you always want to be respectful and think a little bit further beyond yourself, is what am I doing and what will it impact? So a lot of times people don't realize that the pesticides that they might spray onto their plants and things get back to our frogs. And with that moist skin, and even though toads have kind of bumpy skin, it's still very moist. With that moist skin, it gets absorbed into their bodies very easily, and it can be pretty effective for them. But I absolutely love our frogs and toads, and I know that Lauren up there at Mommy Bay has a few in her nature center that she would love to share with you guys today. Lauren, would you like to show us your frogs and toad?
Absolutely. I know Jenna's going to switch the video over to me in a second. But I have actually 3 different species of frogs to show you. I don't think you can see me yet. I think I have a question for Catherine though. Oh, there I go. All right, so I have 3 different species to show you, and actually I have 3 of the most common species here up in the north at Mommy Bay, and they're some of the most common that you can actually find in your backyard as well. So the first one I'll start off with is actually the biggest species of frog in Ohio, and she is a very, very active frog. All right. Oh, she's even talking to me. This is my American bullfrog. So as I mentioned, this is the largest species of frog in Ohio, not the largest amphibian, but the largest species of frog. And she can actually get up to 2 pounds, which is very large if you're a frog. And as you can hear kind of her call, that's one of her defenses. So she's trying to basically kind of scare me away. She's making that call to kind of saying, leave me alone, stop touching me. And she's also doing something else. So I'm not squeezing her really at all, but you may notice that she's really, really, really round. And what she's doing is she's filling up her belly with air because she's trying to make herself look way too big for me to eat. And why she's doing that is because her predators, like water snakes are a big one, as well as a lot of birds, have to swallow this frog whole. And so if she's too big for me to fit in my mouth, that means I can't swallow her whole, so that means I'm not going to eat her. Now, this frog is actually a regulated species by the Division of Wildlife. You can actually hunt these frogs. Now, bullfrogs, if you've ever had frog legs before, bullfrogs are one of the frogs that you've probably eaten because they have big, long legs that are very adept to jumping. She can actually jump about 12 feet horizontally, which is a very, very, very large leap. Now, because of that, that makes them have enough meat for you to eat. And so these frogs are actually protected by hunting. There's a specific a specific season for bullfrogs and a limit of what you can catch, but you actually have to have your fishing license to gather these frogs. And there's another species that is very large, the green frog, which lives up to their name. They are green. They can also be a little bit brown and kind of gray almost, but they are mostly green. They look very similar to our bullfrog, but they also can be collected with a fishing license as well. So, and when I'm talking about this bullfrog, I keep saying she. And why would I say she? That seems weird that I'd be able to know if it's a boy or a girl. Bullfrogs are one of the easier frogs to identify and to distinguish between males and females. The bullfrogs, they have tympanic membranes, so the ears are different sizes in the males or the females. Now, if we get close to this frog, you may see this circle behind her eye. That is her ear, her tympanic membrane, her tympanum. And for females, the circle or the ear is about the same size of the eye or smaller, versus a male, his tympanum, his ears are going to be larger than his eyes. The males are the ones that are going to do the most croaking. They have to defend their territory, so they have to be able to hear really well. So our females are going to have that smaller ear. So I know for sure this one is a girl. Now, and the males also on bullfrogs, they're going to have a yellow throat. So if you notice this lady here, she does not have her yellow throat, and she has the smaller ear, so I know she's a girl. Now, as Catherine mentioned, they do the hoo, hoo, hoo call. They sound like a bullhorn, hence the name bullfrog. So like I mentioned, this is going to be the largest species of frog here in Ohio at almost 2 pounds. And we're going to go on to another little bit smaller frog. So as our bullfrog's very common, our northern leopard frog is extremely common here up by me at Maumee Bay State Park. And they are also well named. So our bullfrog gets its name from the bull horn style call. Our northern leopard frog, which mine is very slippery and not wanting to cooperate, has colorations that are like leopard prints, hence leopard frog. Now, this frog is also doing the same thing, looking like a balloon filled up, and that's because trying to avoid me eating it. This frog doesn't know that I'm not going to eat it, but because I'm larger, I appear to be a potential predator. Now, the leopard frogs are really neat. They actually have gold lining their spots, so it makes them really easy to identify here compared to the other frogs that we have at the marsh. But the leopard frog has those spots. They're also excellent jumpers. They are often found in water. Even though you think they have these spots, they have a bright gold down their dorsal ridge. They'd be they'd be really easy to spot, but it actually acts as really good camouflage. It helps break up their body shape, so it makes them harder to identify out in the wild because they're harder to spot. Now, the leopard frog has lots of predators, snakes, water snakes, garter snakes. Lots of birds will like to eat them, even raccoons, foxes, small mammals will even eat these frogs. And so they have to be able to have that good camouflage. And they're also excellent swimmers and very good leapers. Now, they can't leap the 12 feet that the bullfrog can, but they can also leap very far as well. So here's our leopard frog. Now, you guys may ask, what do frogs eat? So our bullfrog was big. They can get up to 2 pounds. The bullfrogs will eat almost anything and everything that moves. That means they'll eat each other. They're cannibalistic. They'll eat other bullfrogs and other species of frogs. They'll eat insects, so flying insects that land too close to them, insects in the water. They'll also even eat snakes. So especially here at Maumee Bay, we have garter snakes, and so they're much smaller, but they are small enough to fit in that bullfrog's mouth, so he'll start eating them. There's been records of bullfrogs eating ducklings, eating fish, and even eating small mammals such as mice. So if it fits in its mouth and it moves, the bullfrog's going to try to eat it. Now, our leopard frog's the same way, but just on a much smaller scale, and they prefer to eat mostly insects. So next, we're going to move on to my favorite, very favorite amphibian, the American toad. So I know this one's a boy, because he's chirping. You might be able to hear it. It's going to make sure. So the males, when you pick up American toads, they chirp. Well, the females, they do not. So this American toad here has very different skin than my bullfrog and my leopard frog. His skin is dry and rough versus wet and slimy that the bullfrog and the leopard frogs have. And that's because the frogs are much more terrestrial. You're going to find them more on land than you're going to find them in the water like the leopard frog and the bullfrog. Now, this toad is not a leaper. He's a hopper. you're only looking at a couple of inches if you're lucky and you have a very active toad. But our toads also hunt by movement, so he's going to eat things that are alive and moving, but he's going to eat smaller things. And he's actually doing one of the most common defense mechanisms. He's peeing all over me. And it's a really good defense mechanism because if something is trying to eat you and you pee or poop all over yourself, you're not going to taste good anymore. And sometimes the predators will actually let you go. Now, like Catherine was talking about, this toad is poisonous. He carries bufotoxins. He actually has them in these glands behind his eyes and by his ear. And that means that makes him taste really bad and can cause upset stomach and be irritant to the hands and your skin. And so that dissuades him from being eaten by potential predators as well. And since he's not a very good jumper, he's a hopper, and he's a lot more slower than the frogs, he has this nice, like mottled coloration that's the browns. He's also often found in leaf litter. He relies heavily on camouflage and tasting bad to help keep him away from predators. And if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask. And we're going to move back on to Catherine and finish this up. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, if you guys have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Looks like we have a little bit of a delay. I did see some questions about, oh, there we go to Catherine. Oh, Catherine, you're muted.
Not anymore, hopefully?
Nope, you're good.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. I was just apologizing for our technical difficulties, so you see that firsthand right there. But I wanted to take these last few minutes to talk about salamanders. Salamanders aren't going to take nearly as long, and that's because, like I mentioned before, they're very secretive, and unlike frogs, they're very quiet. These are not going to be a species that have all these nice noises that you can hear or that will hint to you that they're there. You have to look for salamanders. Ohio is a spectacular place, though, for salamanders. We have 25 plus species here, all ranging from 5 different families, from the giant salamanders to mud puppies to mole salamanders, lungless salamanders, and we even have a newt species here in Ohio as well. With salamanders, typically what distinguishes them is they are going to have an egg species, a larval species, and then an adult species. But that is not always the case, and we'll talk about that with our other species, because some might not go back to the water, some might never go in the water. Salamanders range from a variety. They do not like to stick into the little boxes we want to create for them. So I love salamanders. The other thing that's really neat about them is in North America, so we are in the right continent for salamanders, because here in North America, we have more salamanders than the entire rest of the world combined. And what I'd like to do on this first slide here is talk to you a little bit about the large mole salamanders that we have here. These are going to be nice, big, kind of chunky salamanders. I love finding these guys out in the wild. They're going to have that nice lungs. So salamanders do breathe oxygen from, can absorb oxygen through their skin. They can absorb oxygen through their nostrils. Even if they don't have lungs, they will still absorb it through their nostrils and it gets dispersed through their body. But these guys have lungs, very well-developed lungs. The species that we have here in Ohio are going to be, I'm going to start from the left side and work my way up and around. We've got the eastern tiger, which is going to be a very kind of sporadically found throughout Ohio. And it's going to have that nice, pretty orange and kind of dark color. The blue spotted salamander up on top is very, very rare. They're beautiful, though, if you get to see them. They have that nice, pretty bluish white color. The marbled salamander, though, is also going to be one, just like the blue spotted, that's very, very rare. And they're also kind of sporadic of where you find them. They're not going to be in one central part of Ohio, but they've got that nice kind of well, as the name suggests, marbled, kind of intermixed black and white color. The very, very rare, the very common one, that we see here in Ohio is going to be that spotted salamander up in the top. Spotted salamanders are one of my favorites. They are one of the first to emerge in springtime. They're going to come out in mass migrations, crossing roads and crossing so many miles to go to these nice big vernal pools, which you'll learn about in our next webinar. Vernal pools are going to be where these amphibians go to lay their eggs. So you can see these big salamanders just crossing the road, and it is an amazing sight to get to see. Spotted salamanders, as well as our other mole salamanders, are beautiful animals. That smallmouth salamander down in the bottom there is going to be a very common species as well, just like the spotted salamander. I see those guys a lot as well. Stream sides are going to be, I see them a lot because I'm in Southwest Ohio, but if you're not here in Southwest, you really don't get to see them as much. And then the last one being the Jefferson is going to be a little bit more sporadic. Something that's really neat in amongst these, mole salamanders, it's actually a unisex salamander. So it's a salamander that looks very similar to our bottom three salamanders, that nice gray color. And it's very hard to tell what a unisex salamander is. And that's because it has DNA from all different salamanders. It doesn't have just one father species or one female, one basically donor. So unisex salamanders are a completely different concept than just these salamanders on their own. What I would like to do though is I am going to go ahead and move to our next slide here. And instead of these nice, big, large, easy to spot salamanders, I would like to talk about some small salamanders. So these small salamanders that we have here in Ohio are going to be lungless salamanders. They don't have gills or lungs. Their oxygen is going to be absorbed through their skin. They like to stay in cool, dark areas. So sometimes they're a little bit tricky to find, but it is amazing when you get to. Let me quickly go through these. We've got the top is our green, endangered, and very rare salamander. That green salamander, I have never seen. It's kind of, like I said, very, very rare. Our cave salamander is the same thing. It is also endangered and rare. We've got that northern dusky, which is very common in Northwest Ohio. So I bet Lauren's seen one before. Our Allegheny dusty, mountain dusty, is also rare, but if you're in Northeast Ohio, which is where my family is from, I know I have seen a mountain dusky up there. And then we've got our long-tailed salamander, which is very common except for in the western part of the state. And then our northern two-lined. Northern two-lines are incredibly common wherever you are in the state. Let me move to our next slide here to talk about a few other of our lungless salamanders. And these are going to be a little bit more vibrantly colored. We've got the Midland mud, which is pretty rare and is found more in southern Ohio. We have the spring, which is a little bit sparse, but found more in eastern Ohio. We've got our northern red, which again, a little sparse unless you're in eastern Ohio. Our four-toed, which is up in the top here, is going to be very sporadic, kind of all throughout Ohio. The slimy is going to be found more commonly in Northwest Ohio, and then the ravine is common, but just not in the west. And the last one that I want to talk about here is going to be our eastern redback, which is very common. You're going to see it all over Ohio. Every time I look for a salamander, I find at least one of those guys. Let me move to our next slide here, because we've got our last three salamander species in Ohio that are kind of the oddballs. We have our mud puppy, which is actually found all over Ohio. It's just very, very, very rare to see because they like to stay in deep, murky water. They've got those nice, pretty reddish gills there, and you just don't get a chance to glimpse them that often. Same thing with our hellbender, which is going to be our largest amphibian in Ohio. It is, again, kind of found more in eastern Ohio. It's found in very swift, very fast moving water, and they do have lungs, but they often spend so much time in the water that they do still maintain their gill slits, and they get most of that oxygen through that way. The very last one I want to talk about today is our red-spotted newt on our next slide. Newts are still a salamander. They're just in a separate family from all these other guys, and the way that they kind of differ is they have 3 stages of life. So as I move to my next slide here, you'll be able to see that real quick. Just one moment here. The 3 stages of life, you know, we still have to have our egg, but then they go to a larval state. So that with their gills is going to be found on, you know, in the water. And then they come up on land and become that red eft. Now that's very easy to see out in the wild because it's a nice bright color. But what they're going to do after a few years is they're actually going to return back into the water and live the rest of their life as an adult in the water. So it's very unique for a salamander. The next slide that I have here for you guys is I actually want to talk about in my last minute is how these salamanders and you kind of interact. So a big thing you always want to do with salamanders is I will go ahead and actually, if I can take off my slideshow and just have you look at me, I want to show you something really quick. I have a bottle of water here, and that's because I'm going to dampen my hands. I said that salamanders breathe through their skin. And if you ever see a salamander out in the wild, it's really important, one, just leave them alone. Because their skin is so sensitive, you can actually suffocate a salamander by picking it up. If you submerge it in water, you can actually drown that salamander. It has to have a very particular lifestyle to survive. But what I have for you guys today, if I can exit out of my slideshow and show you real quick, is a salamander species. And I'm going to be very careful. I've dampened my hands, and I'm just going to hold them for a brief moment. I have with me today a long-tailed salamander. And this, remember, is a lungless salamander. Its tail is going to take up more than half of its body length. There we go. Sorry about that, guys. It's going to take up almost half their body length. It's going to be found a little bit more in woody areas. Very kind of shale banks is going to be perfect for these guys. That's why we have them around here. But they've got that nice speckled color to them. And he went ahead. There we go. There we go. Shale banks, that's why I get to see him so much. But I'm going to go ahead and put him back in here. And the very last one I wanted to show you is this 2-lined salamander. This 2-lined salamander, you can find it wherever you are in Ohio. If you're in northern Ohio above Route 70, you're going to find a northern salamander, northern 2-lined. And he's got those 2 lines right on his back there. But if you are in southern Ohio below 70, you find a southern line species. And if you're around the Columbus area, you get a little bit of both. But what kind of questions do you guys have as we conclude our webinar today? And I want to
There are a lot of questions, Catherine, but let's just do a few because we are a little bit over time.
Sorry,
Wade
guys.
would like to know, are garter snakes immune to the toxin?
So there are some species of animals that are immune to toxins, but with our salamanders and our frogs, almost all species want to kind of steer clear of them. That would include a garter snake. Garter snakes are going to eat some invertebrates, more like worms are really great for garter snakes, little grubs, and things like that.
Okay, and then Theo and Charlotte would like to know, do toads have multiple eyelids? And then we had another question related to their eyes that a couple people wanted to know, do they have to blink to swallow?
That is an interesting question. With the eyelids, a lot of animals, not us, have what we call a nictitating membrane. That membrane is going to act like a second eyelid, but what it really does is just kind of protect their eyes. It goes over their eye and moistens it. It also, if the animal is underwater, acts as almost like goggles. I know you can see this in beavers, any species that really kind of dual purposes their life will have that coverage. Birds will also have a nictitating membrane because as they fly, they get debris in their eyes, and that could act as something to help moisten and clear their eyes as well.
All right, we are over time. I mean, you guys had so many great questions, and I'm really sorry that we weren't able to address all of them. If you want to join us next week, again, Wednesday at 10 o'clock, we're going to be talking about vernal pools. which is a great place for amphibians to lay their eggs and complete the water stage of their life cycle. So if you want to learn more about that, join us next Wednesday at 10. And also next Tuesday, we have a webinar with some of our foresters, which is going to be about how to prevent wildfires, which is pretty topical right now. So that will be Tuesday at 10 with Aaron Kloss and Courtney Kaywood of our forestry division. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.